Pay attention to the man walking through the supermarket entrance in this CCTV footage. That's 39-year-old Martez Abram, wearing a dark jacket and carrying a concealed handgun. Shoppers pass by without noticing him. He moves steadily toward the back of the store, where his co-workers are beginning their shifts. Everything looks ordinary, just another morning at the South Haven Walmart. However, what they don't know is that Abram has returned with deadly intent. Hours earlier, he'd been suspended from his job, and now he's ready to unleash his rage. The calm of the store is about to explode into chaos. Moments later, gunfire erupts. Employees scramble for cover as Abram opens fire, aisles filled with screams and alarms blaring. The same courtroom that will later echo with verdicts will hold everyone breathless, waiting to see what fate awaits Martez Abram. July 30th, 2019, a Tuesday morning in South Haven, Mississippi. The kind of morning where people grab their coffee, clock in, and settle into routine. At the local Walmart on Tullahoma Road, employees filtered in for the early shift. Customers browsed aisles. The store hummed with ordinary life. Brandon Gales was there, a department manager and loving father, the kind of man his aunt would later describe as caring and hardworking, someone who truly loved his family. Anthony Brown was there too, another manager, another father, a husband whose wife would one day have to stand in a courtroom and speak the words no spouse should ever have to say. No one at the Walmart that morning knew they were about to become part of something unthinkable.
He also said the quick response of South Haven and Horn Lake police saved lives that day.
The 911 calls started flooding in just after 6:30 a.m. Gunshots, people running. Panic spreads through the store like wildfire. Shoppers abandoned carts mid-aisle. Parents clutched their children. Within minutes, the parking lot transformed into a sea of flashing lights. South Haven Police, Horn Lake Police, Fire and EMS, Sheriff's deputies. The response was massive, urgent, overwhelming. Yellow police tape transformed the familiar parking lot into a crime scene.
South Haven, Mississippi making national headlines at this hour. 2 Walmart employees killed, an officer hurt this morning. The shooter just identified, recently suspended by Walmart.
Inside the store, 2 men lay dead, Brandon Gales and Anthony Brown. Martez Abram, a recently suspended Walmart employee, had returned to his former workplace with a weapon and deadly intent. In minutes, he fired multiple shots, killing 2 of his former co-workers and setting fire to the baby section of the store. These 2 men were shot and killed where they worked. Both would never go home again. But the violence hadn't ended. As officers swept through the building, they found him on the west side. The shooter, he opened fire on police, striking 1 officer. The officer returned fire. Both men went down. The injured officer survived. His bulletproof vest took the impact. But it was more than the vest that saved lives that day. Just weeks earlier, the department had completed active shooter training. The kind of training that prepares you for the absolute worst-case scenario. That training was put to the test, and it worked.
The judge handed down 2 death sentences, 1 for each of his victims, and a life sentence for the attempted murder of South Haven police officer Brandon Billingsley, who was also shot during the attack.
Outside in the parking lot, the human cost became clear. Employees embraced each other. Some sobbed, others stared in shock. Emergency personnel moved among them, offering comfort, checking for injuries, trying to make sense of the senseless. The fire was put out quickly. The suspect was rushed to Regional 1 Hospital in Memphis, under guard, in custody. The investigation was just beginning, but authorities already knew who they had.
I do believe we have our man.
DeSoto County District Attorney John Champion is talking about Martez Abram, accused of killing 2 workers this morning at this store.
By that afternoon, law enforcement stood before cameras to address a shaken community. The man in custody wasn't a stranger to Walmart. He'd worked there, knew the layout, knew the people. But something changed recently. He'd been suspended. And on this Tuesday morning, he'd returned with a gun. By evening, the suspect had been formally identified and charged. The case was just beginning. But one thing was already certain. July 30th, 2019 would be a date this community would never forget.
hitting and injuring one of the officers. The officer returned fire, injuring Abram.
Smoke had barely cleared before investigators moved in. Crime scene technicians swarmed the South Haven Walmart, documenting every detail, every piece of evidence, every shred of proof they'd need to put Martez Abram away forever. The scale of the response said everything. This wasn't just another shooting, this was capital murder. And the DeSoto County District Attorney was about to make that crystal clear.
We will begin the extradition process back to DeSoto County.
No hesitation, no doubt, they had their man. While Abram lay in his hospital bed under armed guard, detectives executed search warrants. They seized his home, his car, at least 2 firearms, the weapons he'd used to carry out his attack. Every piece of evidence mattered, every detail counted, because this case had to be airtight. But there was something else investigators discovered, something that revealed just how calculated Abram's actions had been. The fire wasn't random, it wasn't accidental, it was deliberate, an attempt to cause maximum chaos, maximum destruction, while he hunted down the men he'd come to kill.
I have a lot of emotions, but my emotions basically is toward the employees that witnessed it, and knew these people worked with them every day.
For the employees who'd witnessed the attack, who'd worked alongside Brandon and Anthony every day, the trauma was overwhelming. These weren't just victims on a news report. These were their friends, their managers, people they'd laughed with, worked with, depended on. The emotional toll was immeasurable, but the community's response was immediate. South Haven's mayor addressed the tragedy head-on, acknowledging what everyone already knew. No city was immune to this kind of violence anymore.
No city in America is immune to this. Unfortunately, it's sad, but it just shows how important the training is.
The training had worked. The preparation had saved lives. But 2 families were still planning funerals. 2 fathers were still dead. And nothing, no amount of training, no amount of preparation could bring them back. As evidence piled up and the case took shape, one thing became abundantly clear. Martez Abram wasn't just a disgruntled employee who'd snapped. He was a calculated killer who'd armed himself, targeted specific victims, and executed a plan designed to maximize death and destruction. The mayor had more to say about the officers who'd responded that day, men who'd run toward the gunfire while everyone else ran away.
Our police really showed their guts today. If it hadn't been for their efforts, there'd have been more lives lost.
Those officers had shown their guts. They'd done their jobs. They'd stopped a killer. And because of them, fewer families were mourning. The DeSoto County District Attorney's Office wasted no time. While Abram recovered from surgery at Regional One Health Center in Memphis, prosecutors prepared their case. The charges were clear. 2 counts of capital murder for the deaths of Brandon Gales and Anthony Brown. 1 count of attempted murder for shooting officer Brandon Billingsley. In Mississippi, capital murder carried only 2 possible sentences: life without parole or death. The investigation had given them everything they needed. The evidence was overwhelming. The witnesses were numerous. The surveillance footage was damning. Abram's own actions had left no room for doubt. But building a death penalty case required more than just proof of guilt. It required proof of aggravating factors, elements that made the crime so heinous, so brutal, so calculated, that death was the only appropriate punishment. And this case had aggravating factors in abundance. Multiple victims, workplace violence, attempted murder of a police officer, arson, premeditation, the deliberate targeting of specific individuals. As investigators continued their work, as prosecutors reviewed evidence, as families grieved and a community struggled to heal, one question loomed over everything. Would a jury sentence Martez Abram to die for what he'd done? The investigation had given prosecutors their case. Now they'd have to present it in court. They'd have to show a jury the evidence. They'd have to prove beyond any doubt what Abram had done. The courtroom doors would soon open. The trial would begin. And Martez Abram would have to answer for every bullet he'd fired, every life he'd taken, every family he'd destroyed. Justice was coming. The only question was what form it would take.
That verdict coming in within the last hour. ABC 24 was there for the final day of trial as the now convicted killer took the stand.
Defendants in capital murder cases rarely testify. The risks are enormous. Once you take that stand, the prosecution gets to cross-examine you. They get to force you to face the evidence. They get to make you watch what you did. And that's exactly what happened to Martez Abram. The prosecution had video evidence, surveillance footage from inside the Walmart that captured everything: the shootings, the victims falling, Abram firing shot after shot. And they were going to make him watch it. In the courtroom, the video began to play. The jury watched, the families watched, the judge watched. And Martez Abram watched himself commit murder. The tension was suffocating.
Stop. Mr. Gale is on the floor going down at this point, isn't he? Yes.
Abram couldn't take it. He broke, completely and utterly broke. "Stop," he cried out, his voice cracking with anguish. But the prosecution wasn't stopping. They were just getting started. The cross-examination that followed would have become one of the most devastating moments in the entire trial. Because the prosecution wasn't just showing Abram the footage. They were forcing him to admit what he'd done. Every shot, every victim, every brutal detail. The prosecutor's questions were surgical, precise, unrelenting. The courtroom sat in stunned silence as Abram confirmed what the video had already shown. He'd shot Brandon Gales as he was falling to the ground. He'd continued firing even after his victim was down. But the prosecution wasn't done.
The next question would seal Abram's fate.
Yes. That's you shooting him?
Yes.
Can you admit that you shot him in cold blood?
Yes. The words hung in the air like a death sentence. In cold blood. Not self-defense. Not in the heat of passion. Not by accident.
Those three words would follow Abram for the rest of his life, however long that would be. The defense had gambled by putting Abram on the stand. They'd hoped he could explain himself, maybe show remorse, maybe convince the jury that this was something other than premeditated murder. Instead, Abram had confessed to everything, on the record, under oath, in front of the jury that would decide whether he lived or died. The cross-examination continued, each question tightening the noose. Abram admitted to shooting 2 people. He admitted to injuring Officer Brandon Billingsley. He admitted he'd bought the gun. He admitted he'd gone to Walmart that morning with that gun. Every admission was another nail in his coffin. The prosecution had done what seemed impossible. They'd gotten the defendant to admit to capital murder in his own words, on video, in front of the jury. When Abram finally stepped down from the stand, he destroyed any chance of avoiding a conviction. His own testimony had become the most damning evidence against him. The facts were clear. The verdict was inevitable. But the trial wasn't over. Before the sentence was sealed, the courtroom paused because the people who'd loved the victims most still needed to speak.
Brandon was the most loving and caring, hardworking young man that I know. And he truly loved his family.
Tracy Tucker Norman's words painted a picture of who Brandon really was. Not a victim, a person. A nephew who loved his family fiercely. A young man who worked hard, who showed up, who cared about the people around him. The kind of person who made a place like Walmart more than just a job. It was where he built relationships, where he looked out for his team, where he took pride in what he did. But there was a cruel irony that hung over every word Tracy spoke.
Brandon would work long hours at Walmart, but it's also the place where he lost his life.
Walmart, the place Brandon loved to work. The place where he'd laughed with coworkers, helped customers, managed his team with care and dedication. That same place became the location of his murder. For Tracy and her family, the loss was unbearable. But it wasn't just grief they were processing. It was the senselessness of it all, the randomness, the fact that Brandon's life ended not because of anything he'd done, but because Martez Abram couldn't handle being fired.
Brandon died doing his job.
He died at work. He died because he was there. The courtroom sat in silence as Tracy's testimony continued. Every word carried the weight of a family trying to make sense of something that would never make sense.
It didn't happen overnight. Forgiveness didn't come that easily. But with prayer, over time, we were able to forgive you for what you've done.
Forgiveness. That word hung heavy in the air. Tracy and her family were Christians. Their faith told them they had to forgive Martez Abram for what he'd done. But forgiveness doesn't erase pain. It doesn't bring Brandon back. It doesn't undo the trauma, the nightmares, the empty chair at family dinners. But they chose it anyway. Not because Abram deserved it, not because it made the pain go away, but because their faith required it. Because holding on to that hatred would have poisoned them too. It was one of the most powerful moments of the entire trial. A family broken by violence, choosing grace. A woman standing in front of her nephew's killer, saying the words that must have felt impossible to say. Tracy's testimony wasn't just about Brandon. It was about what workplace violence really costs. It's not just lives lost. It was about families shattered. It's children who grow up without fathers. It's aunts who will never hear their nephews laugh again. It's co-workers who will never feel safe at work again. But Brandon wasn't the only victim. There was another family still waiting to speak. Another father who was taken too soon. Another life destroyed. And when Anthony Brown's widow stood to address the court, the emotional devastation would only deepen. The courtroom fell silent as Andrea prepared to deliver her statement. Every eye turned toward her. Even Abram, seated at the defense table, couldn't escape what was coming. Andrea didn't just speak about loss. She didn't just talk about grief. She confronted Martez Abram directly, addressing him by name, making him face the consequences of what he'd done.
But they do not have to cost you your eternity. God will forgive you of your sins, and He is the only one that can save your soul.
Andrea Brown had done something extraordinary. Standing in front of the man who'd murdered her husband, she delivered a message that was both a condemnation and a plea. Yes, what Abram did should cost him his life on this earth. The jury had already decided that. The judge would soon confirm it. His actions on July 30th, 2019 were unforgivable in the legal sense. But Andrea went further. She reminded Abram and everyone in that courtroom that earthly justice wasn't the final judgment. That while his actions had cost him his life in this world, they didn't have to cost him his soul. God would forgive him. But only if he asked, only if he truly repented, only if he faced what he'd done and sought redemption. It was an act of remarkable spiritual courage to stand before your husband's killer and tell him that salvation was still possible. That took a strength most people couldn't fathom. Andrea wasn't excusing what Abram had done. She wasn't asking the court for mercy. She wasn't saying he shouldn't be punished. She was saying that while the state would take his life, God could still save his soul if he chose to seek it. Brandon Gales and Anthony Brown were fathers. They were loved. And on July 30th, 2019, Martez Abram took all of that away, not in self-defense, not by accident, but deliberately, with premeditation, with malice. The jury had heard all of it, the surveillance footage, the admissions, the evidence. But the victims' families' testimonies gave them something the evidence alone couldn't: the human cost. It made Brandon Gales and Anthony Brown real. It made their loss tangible. It reminded everyone in that courtroom that behind every murder charge, behind every conviction, there are people who loved the victim, people whose lives will never be the same. And they'd made it impossible for anyone, jury, judge, or spectator, to forget that Brandon Gales and Anthony Brown mattered. Their lives mattered, their works mattered, their love for their family mattered. And the fact that Martez Abram took all of that away mattered too. The jury had heard enough. They'd seen the surveillance footage. They'd heard Abram's admissions. They'd watched him break down crying as he faced what he'd done. Now they had to decide. The deliberations would be shockingly brief. After everything, the testimony, the evidence, the emotional victim impact statements, The jury needed less than 60 minutes to reach a unanimous. That's all it took. They'd seen Abram admit to shooting Brandon Gales in cold blood. They'd watched him confirm he'd shot Anthony Brown. They'd heard him acknowledge shooting Officer Billingsley. There was no reasonable doubt, no question of guilt, no debate to be had. Martez Abram was guilty of everything. The courtroom waited as the jury filed back in. Abram sat at the defense table, his head down, knowing what was coming. The verdict was clear. Death.
Abram offered a brief apology to the families before the judge handed down 2 death sentences, one for each of his victims, and a life sentence for the attempted murder of South Haven police officer Brandon Billingsley, who was also shot during the attack.
2 death sentences, one for Brandon Gales, one for Anthony Brown, plus a life sentence for the attempted murder of South Haven police officer Brandon Billingsley. The ultimate punishment, delivered with the finality that only a capital case can carry. Martez Abram would face execution for what he'd done. The state of Mississippi would take his life, just as he'd taken the lives of Brandon Gales and Anthony Brown. The families absorbed the news with tears, not joy. You can't feel joy when your loved ones are still gone, but relief. Relief that justice had been served. Relief that the system had worked. Relief that Abram would face the consequences his crimes demanded. What the death penalty provided was acknowledgement. Acknowledgement from the community, from the legal system, from the state itself, that these lives mattered, that these murders were so severe, so unjustifiable, that only the ultimate punishment could adequately respond. Martez Abram would spend whatever time he had left on death row. The appeals process would drag on for years. It always does in capital cases. But the outcome was decided. The jury had spoken. The judge had confirmed it. 2 death sentences, one for each victim he'd murdered in cold blood.
So with that said, I will say I'm extremely pleased with what we had. I hope this sends a message to everybody that DeSoto County is a safe place to live, and it is not a place to come and commit crime.
The verdict sent a message far beyond this courtroom. A message to anyone considering workplace violence, to anyone thinking about targeting innocent people, to anyone who believed they could commit mass murder without facing the ultimate consequences. DeSoto County had spoken. Mississippi had spoken. And the message was clear. Acts of this magnitude would be met with the full force of the law.